Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Bruce.
And I'm Josh, and we're your farm management hosts. Let's get started.
Josh, it's good to be back with you on the podcast. And gosh, we're getting close to spring, so we got to have a spring sport to talk about. I enjoy baseball. How about you? Do you like the game of baseball?
Bruce, I cannot watch baseball. Baseball is just like watching paint dry on the fence. It's not my cup of tea. This time around, I'm just gearing up for college football and NFL football to start. I get my break. I can stop watching Taylor Swift on my TV and I can relax and I can start planning for the upcoming season. So now spring football is coming up. Ohio State spring game's coming up. The NFL draft's coming up. So that's all I'm watching right now. What about you? What about baseball? Do you like baseball, Bruce?
I love watching MLB baseball. I really do, whether it's in person or on TV. Do I nap between the fourth and seventh inning? Maybe some afternoons I do, but I really enjoy kind of the pace and take it in, kind of the sport that it is. I really enjoy the Cleveland Guardians. And this year, I want to visit and attend a couple series of baseball games at Ohio State University. So looking forward to their upcoming spring season. And it's really a great relaxing time for me. I know I'm a little bit older than you, Josh, so maybe my pace of sport is a little bit slower and I'm a little bit take it easy sometimes just watching that game, but it's enjoyable.
Yeah, I think it's just my ADHD. I just can't focus on that game for so long whenever it's like 5 hours long. Can't do that.
Yeah, someday maybe. Well, Josh, we have a great guest with us today. Our guest today is Garth Ruff. Garth is an OSU Extension field specialist in beef cattle. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Extension, a colleague of yours and mine, and we're just glad to have Garth along this episode. Garth, welcome to the podcast.
Glad to be here, fellas. Josh, one of these days, maybe you'll learn to appreciate the game of baseball. It's just like drinking a good cup of coffee. It's an acquired taste.
Well said, Garth. So, Garth, we're going to kick things off today. We're actually going to talk about beef production, beef cattle, and specifically dive into freezer beef and some of the components of that type of enterprise for a farm operation. So, you get to speak to a lot of groups across Ohio and throughout the Midwest, and you ask them a couple of questions about, why are they in the local beef production business? And why do customers want to buy their beef? What kind of answers do you often hear from growers in the audience?
Yeah, Bruce, when we ask folks, why are they producing beef, freezer beef, or direct-to-consumer beef, we throw all these terms out, local beef, right? And at the end of the day, it's all the same thing. But some of the answers that we hear, they're trying to generate additional revenue, increase a greater percentage of that food dollar that comes back to the farm. As we kind of go through this, oftentimes we find that maybe they're not as profitable as they think they are. We look at cost of production type of things, but that's their ultimate goal, is to generate increased revenue. As far as why they have repeat customers, usually comes down to one or two things. The first being, they bought beef from me before and they enjoyed it, right? So eating experience is paramount. And then the other piece of this, there's often that relationship between the producer, who is the seller, and then the consumer being the end user.
Garth, can you tell me a little bit about freezer beef, talking about our marketing options in terms of risk and potential profit?
Yeah, with the beef industry being as segmented as it is and growers of all sorts and shapes and sizes, we do have several marketing options for fed cattle. As we think about risk, freezer beef, if that producer knows their cost of production, should be pretty low risk, right? We should be able to kind of guarantee a profit, if you will, and be a kind of a price maker versus a price taker. On the profit side of things, I often talk about freezer beef as low profit potential because we don't want to charge the neighbor too much, right? We're maybe too conservative as it relates to cost of production and margin, or the profit potential can be pretty great depending on the marketing strategy and the margin achieved.
And Garth, as we look at really what it boils down to, what is freezer beef? How do we package it? How do we market it? What are some of the advanced direct marketing strategies or things to consider that growers need to keep in mind?
Yeah, Bruce, especially pre-COVID, right? Kind of the traditional method of marketing freezer beef was wholes, halves, and quarters. And the value to the customer, the consumer there, was they were getting a bulk discount. Really wasn't adding value to the product. The value was you were buying in bulk and averaging that price over a significant number of pounds. going forward, we think about more advanced direct marketing options for meat cuts, really looking at retail cut, right? How can I add value maybe in addition or in a different way than just mass bulk and quantity? And it requires some creativity, certainly inventory management, marketing, and we got to be able to guarantee in some form or fashion confidence in eating experience as we go from whole halves and quarters to retail beef.
Garth, obviously the carcass is very important in terms of freezer beef because if we have poor quality beef, we're going to have a hard time marketing that value, marketing that beef. In terms of our carcass value, how does that determine for our carcasses?
Josh, that's a tougher question to answer in a freezer beef or local beef market. In commodity beef, it's pretty simple. Every carcass that goes through one of the big packing plants is graded by USDA, right? And we have quality grades. You're probably familiar with prime, choice, and select. And we have yield grades that look at muscle versus fat, essentially. The big packers have a system in place or a marketing grid that assigns value in a matrix to each of those quality and yield grades. In most cases, we don't have that when we're selling freezer beef. So quality is tough to define. Typically, we talk about quality grade as marbling primarily, but in a local beef situation, we're really talking about eating experience, right? And we might not know that until after that beef's sold, we get a return customer. We can get a pretty good idea in terms of yield, muscle versus lean, but we need to know cost of production, and we got to have factors in place such as genetics and nutrition that help cushion us or promote a positive eating experience.
So what type of improvements or how would we make improvements to that customer experience or that consumer experience when it comes to the sizzle on the grill or the taste in the mouth or all those things that customer would come back and say, Garth, I want some more of that beef for these reasons. As a producer, what do you do?
As a producer, I think there's three things to think about. And, I often throw the question out there, which of the following is most important in terms of beef quality? Is it genetics, the genetics of that animal? Is it nutrition? The composition of the feed we feed that animal? And then I like to talk a little bit about management, right? Animal health, animal handling. And there's probably no 100% correct answer depending on who's in the crowd. I think we got to start the conversation with beef quality with genetics. That animal has to have the genetic potential to deposit marbling, right? Have the genetic potential to produce a tender product. One of my advisors during my time in the animal science department at Ohio State laid it out this way. From the time that animal's born to the time we harvest it, as growers, basically all we can do is screw it up. We can screw up that genetic potential with mismanagement, with improper nutrition, right? I think it's a combination of those three. If we're thinking about quality, certainly it's those three. If yield's a challenge, it's timely marketing. There's a genetic component here. I think, Bruce, maybe the thing that we undersell is when we're in this local beef business is educating our customer, right? How to use certain cuts of beef, right? How to use a meat thermometer. And you've heard this speech before, right? I had to go to college to know what a pork chop should taste like, right? Because my mother tended to overcook them. Just that basic education of what degrees of doneness are, what palatability is, and there's a huge opportunity there if I'm selling beef direct to the consumer.
And a follow-up question on genetics, is it more than just picking the breed that we might have on the farm, or how much is it breed or is it genetics within that line of breed?
So breed's a big piece of it. And, if you look at what's happened in the beef industry for the last 30, 40 years, certainly that conversation's been dominated by Angus, and really because of the success of the certified Angus beef program. It's a marketing program, but with the specifications that program's put in place, there's guardrails to ensure that it's a quality product. And then certainly within breeds, whichever breed a grower decides to select, there's certainly differences. So looking at EPDs, genomics, all the genetic information available, if we're in a freezer beef or direct-to-consumer business, we need to be cognizant of some of those genetics that the bigger cow-calf operations, the bigger feedlots, and then the packers have interest in, right? At the end of the day, I want to produce the kind of beef that the customer wants to eat.
So, Garth, you've kind of already touched on this a little bit, kind of looking at our cost of production, which I know looking at the cattle markets right now, what are the costs that we need to factor into our freezer beef operation? And what's the difference between our producers that are selling freezer beef and to those large retail stores that are selling their beef?
Yeah, so we'll try to unpack that. And I might start with the last piece first. What's the difference between the big box stores and then the producer selling direct to the customer? Certainly there's economy of scale there. But what a lot of folks don't realize is with having that quality defined, with that stamp on the package, has tremendous value to the big box stores because consumers can walk through the retail case and they understand that there is value, things like certified Angus beef, even choice, right? Consumer recognizes that there's value to that. So that's probably the biggest difference in addition to some economy of scale as it relates the kind of that relationship between the big box stores and direct to consumer sales. As far as cost of production, we're looking at unprecedented cattle prices in this country. The long story short is we had a widespread drought really back late 21, all of 22, still dry in parts of the country in 23. So we're dealing with the smallest cow herd since 1960 and
Wow.
and the smallest total cattle inventory since in the 50s. So feeder cattle are going to be at a premium price in 2024 and even going forward for the next year or two, unless external factors screw this cattle market up, right? There's black swan events, things we can't really prepare for. So we got pretty high cost in the animal, right? Whether I produced that animal, there's an opportunity cost where I could have sold it, or if I purchased that animal. Feed, maybe the positive in this story is corn's cheaper than it's been previously. The value of that person's time, all the things that come into harvest and packaging. And the big thing is advertising and labor. We probably undersell ourselves in the time it takes to sell a half or a whole beef, depending on our methods of marketing.
Garth, you've recently developed and updated a tool, you and a colleague, and I want to shout out to Stan Smith. And if you could kind of give a little bit of background on Stan Smith and his co-authorship and leadership of this budget tool that you've been updated and put together. I'm really excited about this tool, and it has some traditional components, but there's 3 total components altogether in this budget. Let's take a look at the first component, and I'll give you a chance to give that shout out to Stan. But let's talk about that yearling steer budget portion of this Excel spreadsheet that's available for growers.
For our listeners who might not be familiar with Stan, Stan's been a program assistant in the Fairfield County office for longer than I've been alive, quite frankly, and done a lot of the background work for the OSU beef team. The weekly newsletter, YouTube, social media, really brought that newsletter to the forefront as far as an extension output here over the last almost 40 years. So the first page of that budget's kind of similar to what would our traditional yearling steer, bunk fed daily type system budget would look like. When I started an extension, we had, I think, 6 different cattle feeding budgets: steers, heifers, yearlings, calves. And we sat down one day and after talking with Stan and a couple others, come up with just 2 based on how we feed that animal. Are they on a self feeder or are they getting a TMR? Are we managing intake type ration? So that first page, Bruce, really not a whole lot different. It does take into consideration feeding system. When we reworked it in a way that made growers have to ask questions.
Yeah.
They need to know what their estimated daily gain is, and they need to have an idea on feed conversion.
There's really those great pieces in there, starting with the beginning weight, their estimated finish weight of that steer. And then, like you said, putting in their feed per pound of gain, and estimated daily gain. And that's gonna be maybe the first time a grower uses this budget, they're going to use the maybe standard numbers. But what if they ended up keeping records on their own, and they're going to beat this budget or beat these numbers of the average and still produce a quality calf and steer? So this is a great tool just to incorporate not just the economic record keeping, but also the production records, I think, are essential for this.
Yeah, I mean, that's the ultimate goal, is when we put this together to encourage beef producers to keep better records, because a lot of times we use a book value and we kind of sell ourselves short. And to work with those folks in the business, whether it's nutritionists, veterinarians, right? If they don't understand what just a ballpark figure is for feed conversion, right? Pick up the phone, and if you're a farmer in Jackson County, call Josh Winters, right? And he can have that conversation with those growers.
Garth, looking at the second page of the calculator, I see that's talking about buildings and equipment. How are the buildings and equipment accounted for into this budget?
The second page is the one that makes us scratch our head the most. You know, a lot of the book values out there on overhead cost are for the large feed yards in the West, right? Feed yards that are feeding tens of thousands of head of cattle. The best numbers we can come up with are kind of for 750 head feedlot, which in most cases in Ohio is still larger than the average producer that we're working with. You know, the guy that feeds a dozen steers, it's hard to capture that overhead cost. Their facilities have probably long been depreciated. They might have a skid steer or a tractor that's used to bale hay or for other enterprises on the farm. So it's kind of a tough thing to come up with. You know, my goal would be to get enough cattle feeders in Ohio to go through the FinPact system where we could capture some state values, you know, some farmer feeders and get some more realistic values for this. But at the end of the day, our overhead cost in the budget comes out to $14.19 a head. You know, after we sat and discussed, you know, that's probably pretty realistic for some. It's probably way too cheap for others.
And the third and final tab of this budget tool, this Excel spreadsheet, is really that fed and sold cattle as retail cuts. And this is kind of your baby, Garth. You've and Stan have led this charge to really put a tool in the hands of those that are really going to reach into that freezer beef or local beef market to maybe help them do what? Set their retail price for their product. Walk us through this tool.
Yeah, Bruce. So the third page of the tool really leans on the first two. So we got to have good cost of production numbers to get a good number out of kind of that retail value tab. So we start with the live value of that steer. We plug in a dressing percentage and we can figure out the carcass value pretty quick. Break-even value for that live animal, a break-even value for that carcass based on the numbers provided in the live animal production budget. And then we can plug in cost as it relates to harvest and processing. There's a spot in there for marketing and advertising. We did color code the cells so folks can plug in their own numbers. I don't know what an average cost for marketing and advertising is, but we plug in $100 a head. And then maybe the unique feature of this is we break that carcass down into retail cuts based on a percentage of weight. And we encourage the growers to play with this. They can change this percentage around. But then we pulled USDA retail values from the web and determine the final retail value based on a USDA price. Then we allow growers to plug in what percent profit margin above that USDA value they want to make, right? And when we scroll to the bottom of this thing and our kind of plug-in numbers, when a grower first opens this budget, you know, it's going to show that profit loss selling wholes, halves, and quarters. In this instance, the grower made $264 a head. If they sold the retail cuts at prices listed by USDA compared to the break-even value of the carcass, they actually lost $140 a head. So that profit margin piece is important. You know, as I visit with some folks that have experimented with direct marketing, I think they're really beginning to realize that there's a huge additional cost to sell and market retail cuts versus wholes, halves, and quarters.
And your tool, Garth, has everything listed here from ground beef, patties, and then also every cut of steak imaginable as I look down this list here, as well as those roasts. And by golly, you even got the tongue and liver in there. So very detailed, great work on that list.
And, you know, growers can plug and play with the cuts that they have available or that their processor has available. We link the USDA price sheets right along in there, you know. And just like when we take a beef to the processor, you know, the grower's got to be aware that I cannot have T-bone steaks and boneless filet mignon or boneless tenderloin steaks, right? So we can't double dip based on how we have that beef cut up.
Garth, there's a lot of good information on this calculator. How would someone that is interested in getting a hold of this calculator and kind of playing around with their numbers, seeing how it works, where would they find this calculator at?
Yeah, so we posted this calculator or budget here recently. And if they go to farmoffice.osu.edu and under the enterprise budget tab, it should be there under 2024. And I believe we've got it linked to beef extension webpage as well, beef.osu.edu.
A lot of great information. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of listeners that are going to be hopping on right away just to check out this budget and seeing how their numbers kind of compare for their operation. Is there anything you'd like to share with us before we let you go?
It's warming up outside, springtime. I guess just fire up the grill and eat more beef.
Thanks for listening today.
For more information about farm management tips, be sure to check out the Farm Office at farmoffice.osu.edu.